And we're back. So, just like Dr. Barry, right? So, this is part 3B of Apocalypse Soon. And if you watched part 3A, we talked about the systems that are already in place that will lead to or be part of the one world government as well as the one world religion. Now, today, we are going to be talking about the mark of the beast, the economic system of the tribulation period. But before, let's see here. Got my notes. Yep. Okay, yep. The tip of the iceberg on this is going to be the social credit system, which right now in its genesis is called ESG, and that stands for environmental, social, and governance. These are basically metrics that are used to measure how much someone cares for the environment, how much they care about social justice, and how if they view government as more of a provider instead of a protector of your rights to provide for yourself. That's the leanings of all of the ESG metrics that are out there. I'm going to go through those in pretty good detail. The first link that I have in the description for the ESG section is it's a link to an article, but mainly like a video, like a podcast between two people. And the podcast is, I think it's like an hour long, but it's got like chapters in there, and you can look at just like the genesis of ESG and the different parts of it. Very informative, and that's something that I recommend taking a look at if you want to get more in depth as far as like where ESG came from and why it's so prevalent now. But I also want to say that the whole concept of ESG is similar to what George Carlin once said. He had a bit where he talked about how the powers that be are all in place. They all went to the same schools. They all are part of the same clubs. And it's a big club and you ain't in it. And that's basically what he finished up with. He didn't even realize at the time that he had that bit exactly who he was talking about. He had more of a perspective from his own country in the United States of how it feels like it doesn't matter who gets elected. They all went to the same schools. They all believe the same things. You have a fast version and a slow version, but they're all going in the same direction, essentially. So there's a link in the description below for this one. This is from an analysis that was done in 2016. It's of the makeup of the WEF, the World Economic Forum's board members. These are not the same as now, but the makeup is pretty similar. There's a few more board members. They've remedied a couple of their shortcomings of this time, but just to kind of show where it was 7 years ago, and it's not much different now. 6 of the 24 board members at the time were women, which was 25%. 16 of those 24 are either from North America or Europe, which is about 2/3. Half of the board members are currently, this is again 2016, corporate executives. However, if you look at their careers, 16, which is again 2/3, have corporate backgrounds. And 22 out of the 24 went to universities in the United States or Europe. And 10 went to the same university, which is Harvard. So it's very similar to what George Carlin was talking about with these people in their smoke-filled rooms and back offices making plans for how they want to run everything. It's a big club and you ain't in it. All right. So now there's more members on there. They do have more women. I think it's closer to 30% women now. They've also expanded to more Asian representation, a little bit of African representation, but across the board, most of them are in really high-level executive corporate positions, or they're tied to organizations that do the same. The next link that I have is about the strategic partners of the WEF. There's a community of strategic partners comprises 100 leading companies from around the world, each selected for their commitment to improving the state of the world. And again, that's a nod to, are you on board with the ESG agenda? All right. The partners believe in the power of collaboration to drive positive change and work closely with the Economic Forum, the World Economic Forum, to help shape industry, regional, and global agendas. The list of partners can be found on the WEF website, and I've included a link for that. Just want to name a few of those partners real quick on here for you. We have AIG, Amazon, Bank of America, BlackRock, BP or British Petroleum, Coca-Cola, Google, HSBC, which is the United Kingdom's largest bank, IBM, Johnson & Johnson, JP Morgan Chase, Microsoft, Nestle, which I didn't know this, but I looked it up. Nestle is the largest publicly held food company in the world since 2014. I bet you didn't know that either. Also included is PayPal, Pepsi, Pfizer, and Verizon, just to name a few of the 100 that are on that list. Most of these strategic partners have signed a pledge to use their position and influence to further ESG goals. This is a direct excerpt from the letter that they signed. The commitment. As a responsive and responsible leader committed to the principles of stakeholder capitalism as the most effective means of creating long-term enterprise value and addressing the societal priorities enshrined in the Sustainable Development Goals, I, the undersigned, commit to action within the remit of my responsibilities, duties, and influence to reflect the stakeholder capitalism metrics in my company's reportings to investors and other stakeholders, e.g. annual reports, sustainability report, proxy statements, or other materials. My company will reflect those core metrics that are most relevant and meaningful to our business, or briefly explain why a different approach is more appropriate. Not many of them are going to do that. Publicly support the stakeholder capitalism metrics and encourage my business partners to do so as well. To promote the further convergence of existing ESG standards, frameworks, and principles, and support progress towards a globally accepted solution for common ESG metrics. It's just a big old circle of people slapping each other on the back, saying about how we're going to make the world a better place by doing all of this ESG stuff. And they signed it, submitted it. It's another agreement to do what the World Economic Forum thinks they should do. All right. The next thing I want to point out is that incentives for pay, including bonuses and perks for executives, are now being tied to ESG metrics. The targets are increasingly prevalent in pay. 45% of the 100 companies have an ESG target in the annual bonus, the long-term incentive plan, or both. 37% use ESG in annual bonuses with an average weighting of 15%. So if you have a chief executive officer or a chief operations officer and they are pushing their company in more of a direction towards ESG, they get their little, merit points for that, and they get bonus pay for that. All right. 19% of the FTSE 100 use ESG in their long-term incentive plan with an average weighting of 16%. The most common category of measure in the bonus is social, including measures focused on diversity, employee engagement, and health and safety. The most common category of measure in the long-term incentive plan is environmental, and this typically measures focusing on decarbonization and energy transition. So basically, they're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion for their hiring, their board of directors, all of that stuff. The more diverse it is, the more they're getting bonuses. Not necessarily how good of a job people are doing, but if they check the boxes, then so-and-so gets more bonus money. And then on the other side, the environmental side of things, if they are doing things that are aiming towards more of a smaller carbon footprint or other things that they perceive as being good for the environment, there's also bonuses tied to that, which in itself sounds just fine. Like, those are good things in theory, but if you're talking about running a business, the market itself generally tends to lead towards a more efficient way of developing things. And you want people in place that are going to take charge and be able to do that, regardless of their social background, regardless of their gender, regardless of their race. None of that should matter when it comes to actually trying to achieve the goals that you have for the environmental side. Those two things definitely oppose each other. So it's all a big farce. It doesn't really matter. They're basically just, again, slapping each other on the back and giving each other money for doing these things that they think are better for everybody else. Many, if not most, of the people in director or executive positions for the strategic partners also have resumes that tie them to multiple different organizations that are essentially arms of the World Economic Forum. So it's like a big old web. Like, we have you, that you've done all of this stuff, and now we're going to put you in this position as a leader of this company because we know that you have drank the Kool-Aid and you're going to do the things that we want you to do. So we're going to give you a position of influence and power, right? I could make multiple videos just on those connections, but I only need to show a few to kind of explain. A theme that is most of these organizations have connected is a mission to create long-term shareholder value. And as I've said in the agreement, the commitment that I just quoted earlier, long-term shareholder value is basically corporate doublespeak for we're going to do what the stakeholders want and keep the shareholders calm by saying it's better for the long-term plan, right? The 30 to 50-year plan. Even though we're hemorrhaging money at the moment, it'll be better in the long run. And that's what you should focus on because that's better for everybody. That's what long-term shareholder value actually means. Now, I want to talk about the difference between a shareholder and a stakeholder because a lot of people use those interchangeably, but they're not the same thing, all right? A shareholder is any party, whether it's an individual or a company or an institution that has shares in a publicly traded or owned company. So something that you would have stock in if you have a retirement account, whether it's your 401k, your 403b, your any of that stuff, your IRA, your mutual funds that are in there are portions of companies. You're a shareholder of that company. You have a vested financial interest in the success, the financial success of that company. If you're 63 years old and you're hoping to retire in the next 5 years, you want to make sure that you have your retirement there. You don't want it to go down by 40% in the short term because it's going to be better in 30 years. You're going to retire. You don't want to lose all of your money in the meantime. So that's a shareholder. Those are the people who would be upset about hemorrhaging money right now. Stakeholders in a company include employees, board members, suppliers, distributors, governments, and sometimes even members of the community where a business is operating. The stakeholder concept being somebody who might be affected by the operation of the business, not necessarily financially, but just in any way. So the employees, if they have a good work environment, they are a stake in that company doing business, it affects them. People in the community, if a company is dumping toxic waste into the water and poisoning the people in the community, those people would be stakeholders in the operations of that business. Those are really simple examples, but you can kind of understand how doing things for the sake of the stakeholders on its face seems like a good idea. But if you're doing it at the detriment of the shareholders, then that creates a fiduciary conflict of interest. And it needs to be addressed if you're actually going to be doing what's right for the shareholders and say that you're doing what's right for the shareholders. Those two things don't go together. All right. Now, this is just about British Petroleum, BP. All right. The committee, the board of directors, or the leadership team, whatever you want to call it for BP, the CEO, Chief Executive Officer, is Bernard Looney. He is an influential member in several of these types of groups that I was just talking about with those long-term shareholder values. Number one, he's a steering committee member for the Council for Inclusive Capitalism. He's on the FCLT Global Board. He's a leader in the Energy Transition Task Force of the Sustainable Markets Initiative and an ambassador of the 25 by 25 initiative. Now, if you want to look any of those up, you can. Basically, it's a circle of all the same mentalities, and just look at it from different angles, and they all serve the purposes of the ESG movement. Also, there are 11 members named on the leadership team for BP. 9 of them, all but 2, were appointed in July of 2020. The rest of them were appointed in March of 2022. So nobody on the leadership team for BP has been there for more than 3 years. Right? 22, 3, yeah, 3 years. There's a very interesting thing that happened very shortly after that. Up until July of 2020, BP was talking about expanding their oil exploration, their petroleum exploration by 20 to 40% over the coming years. Then, let's take a look at this picture right here. The company decided to do a turn, and they said, oh, instead of expanding our petroleum exploration, we're actually going to reduce it by 40%. And then we're going to put billions of dollars into alternative forms of energy. Now, there's an article where that picture is quoted from, and it quotes the CEO, again, Bernard Looney, as saying, "We believe that what we are setting out today offers a compelling and attractive long-term position for our investors." And again, that is the same narrative that's being pushed, is that this is good for the 30 to 50 year range. Don't worry about the stuff that's going to happen in the short term, because we are going to hemorrhage money. But in the long term, it's going to be good for everybody. All right. So this leadership team was put in place during a worldwide crisis. I wonder what that could have been. They all share a firm alliance to the principles espoused by the WEF, and they are a perfect outline of the top-down implementation of the ESG system. You can see similar actions from various other corporations, and many of these other strategic partners of the WEF are pushing more and more of these ESG-themed things. Even many companies that are not part of the partnership are still doing some of these things. Now, I want you to listen very carefully to this part. This is the most important part of this video right here. Right? These people are not people that you vote for. They can't be reasoned with. They've already had a taste of the power that comes with disrupting, uprooting different parts of society. They don't care. They do not care if you boycott their stores or their products. Why? Because they know, at least they think they know, the long-term payoff isn't that they will have a business or product that's better for all the people. The payoff, this is why they're doing it, the payoff is that every business that doesn't do what they're doing, ESG, will eventually be shunned by capital investors and banks, as well as certain customers. If those businesses can't get capital, they can't continue to operate. Essentially, they're choking off the other businesses. They're going to hold out as long as they can, doing everything wrong, until it gets to the point where those other businesses, their competitors, can't operate, and they'll win by default. Right? The long-term value for shareholders is that eventually there will be no choice but to do business with those who have good ESG scores. How will big capital investors and banks enforce this? That's where the CBDCs come in. All right. So the next part we're going to talk about is the FedNow system, as well as CBDCs. All right. And without getting too deep into the role of the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, let's just say that they are all connected. Whatever is implemented by one will eventually be adopted by the rest. All right. So that's something you need to understand. Just because we have a Federal Reserve here for the United States and you have the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, separate entities, they all eventually adapt and adopt the same agendas. All right. So I have an article here. Let's see here. There's a link for an article in Forbes, again, about some of the problems with the FedNow system. What the FedNow system is basically a means of transferring funds between parties. All right. It's instantaneous. It operates 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. In its current state, it also removes many of the hindrances, such as hold times and fees associated with transferring funds. You think of it like an interstate highway system compared to the old highway system where you had like Route 66. While it went all the way across the country, it stopped in all of the little towns, and it had traffic lights and stop signs. Those were things that slowed us down, and they were an inconvenience. So when Eisenhower introduced the interstate highway system plan, it removed that impediment. It made things more efficient for travel. All right. Let's see. All right. And that sounds great and convenient. And most people, especially younger people, are going to like the convenience factor of it. And there's going to be other groups of people that are more focused on security. All right. So that's where the FedAccounts enters. You probably never heard the term FedAccounts before. You might have heard of FedNow. You probably heard of CBDC, but you've never heard of FedAccounts, right? These were proposed as early as 2018. They basically would give the general public access to the same benefits enjoyed by commercial banks. These include higher interest rates on savings. And there's a May 1st article from Investopedia that shows that the current rate that banks get when they have their funds deposited with the Federal Reserve that would become available to the general public is 4.9% on savings. Can you imagine having a savings account or even a checking account that yielded 4.9%? The current rate for most of the big banks is between 0.01% and 0.15%. Now that's all the way from Chase to Wells Fargo. You're getting less than 0.06% on your savings in those accounts. Or you could have 4.9% with this Fed account. Wouldn't that be awesome, right? There's also a zero chance of bank runs because the funds that you would keep in the Fed accounts wouldn't need FDIC insurance because the Federal Reserve literally makes the money. It's not like you have to worry about running out of money because they have a virtually infinite amount of money at their disposal. So you wouldn't have the cap of $250,000 to keep in your account for it to be FDIC insured. The only downside that would seem to be is that no one would choose to keep their money in regular commercial banks if they were allowed to keep them in a Fed account. Advocates for the Fed accounts may say that they'll find some sort of workaround for the fact that banks won't have any actual capital because banks do need some money in order to operate. When we put our money in a bank, they use that money to loan things out to people, and they make their money off of the interest that they generate from the loans that they put out. And they're allowed to loan out something like 30 to 90 times the amount that they have in actual deposits. So if a bank has, like, let's say JP Morgan Chase, I believe, has $3.7 trillion worth of assets overall, they can do quite a bit of loans because of the amount of deposits that are on hand for them. But if suddenly you have the general public, the consumers, put all of their money into the Fed accounts, then the commercial banks won't have any operating capital, which means they won't be able to do any lending. So there's some talk of making the commercial banks become essentially lenders as an arm of the Federal Reserve. It gets a little bit wishy-washy there anyway, because what's to say, why would the Federal Reserve do that except to smooth things over in the short term? Because in the long term, they're going to take over it all anyway. If they get the depositors, the people like me and you, to put our cash into a Fed account, slowly but surely everybody's going to do that, and you're not going to have a need for commercial banks anymore. Let's see here. I just wanted to ask a question here. Do you think that the lowered confidence and trust in the big banks that we're seeing, as well as the variety of bubbles that are just waiting to pop? You got a commercial real estate bubble, you've got an auto loan bubble, you've got the interest rates being higher, preventing people from being able to finance things. There's lots of things going on in the banking industry right now that people aren't aware of. That's causing a lot of erosion in the trust of the general public when it comes to banks. Do you think that that's a coincidence? It could be. Could it be organization by the Federal Reserve to gradually move people towards the concept of, I can't trust that bank, I don't want to put my money in that bank. This option over here guarantees that nothing will happen to my money, and I get 4.9% interest on it. Sign me up, right? So, moving on. The FedNow system, which is that highway, the interstate highway system of transferring funds, is actually live. It went live on July 20th. Got a link to an article about that. And it has 35 early adopters, including Chase, JP Morgan Chase, US Bank, and Wells Fargo. I believe that's the number 1, the number 3, and the number 5 largest banks in the United States are already participating in it. And again, most of these corporations are going to be of the mindset of, if I get on board with this system now, even though it looks scary in the future, but if I'm an early adopter, then maybe I'll be spared from all of the heartache that comes later on down the road. But I guarantee you, every bank is eventually going to move to this. There's other research that I was doing about the FedNow system is that essentially it was developed by private entities and then stolen by the Federal Reserve after it had been created and tweaked and gotten to the point where it was workable. And a lot of the restrictions that exist right now when it comes to transferring funds are not problems that exist within the private sector of those banks. They're a result of regulations from the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve has created the problem, and then they said, why don't you guys make a solution for this? And then they stole the solution. So they created the problem, and now they have the solution. And that's all the way things work. They're just going to be moving people over there, and they don't even have to get their hands dirty with having created this particular system that operates efficiently. Anyway, so that ball is rolling. You're going to have more and more banks becoming a part of the FedNow system, which will initially be great because it will still be people operating within the banks, but being able to do things instantaneously. The interstate highway system is in place. Now we just need to get you guys out of those Model Ts that you've been driving around and into this new Tesla Roadster. All right. The Tesla Roadster that we have is called a CBDC. All right. So before I talk about central bank digital currencies, which is what CBDC stands for, I do want to highlight the difference between an actual CBDC and a digitized dollar that you a digitized currency that you might already use. If you have a card with a chip, then you pay for something. If you use PayPal or Venmo or WhatsApp, any of that stuff that does transfer funds around, that's just a bunch of ones and zeros that are moving around. That's a digital transfer of a fiat currency. That's not the same as a digital currency. All right. Let's see here. Basically, the biggest difference is that the money itself would become a liability, which is something that you owe, of the Federal Reserve, not the commercial banks. So once it becomes their liability, it becomes their baby, and they're the ones that are in charge of it. All right. In order to facilitate transactions, whether it's business to business or consumers to business, the Fed would have to be certain of the identity of each party. So there would be an association of you specifically and the business that you're buying something from, or the person that you're buying something from. They would need to make sure, for your security's sake, that it's actually you. The purchasing and selling habits of any party would be available for monitoring at any time for reasons that they would use to line up with, okay, we have to do this because it's part of our verification process. It's for your safety. So we're going to know everything about you. All right. This is why many say that a CBDC would be the end of all forms of privacy, whether that's good or bad. They would know every single thing that you're buying or selling with their currency. All right. Does that sound familiar? A fully digital currency, consumers and businesses would have no true ownership of their money. If someone is suspected of trying to commit a crime by using money, the Fed would have access to that information and the ability to deactivate or freeze their funds. So here's a little difference that I want to look at between crimes now with money versus crimes with a CBDC. Right? The authority figures can freeze assets now. We saw something like that happen up in Canada with some trucker protests that were happening a while ago. But you also see it with criminal organizations and criminal parties. They have their actual banked assets frozen. They can't access them, right? But they can't do that with physical cash, right? That's why you see cash being used for drug deals and bribes. And if the amount of money is going to be exchanged is very, very large, like hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars, then you have money laundering, which is a complicated way of concealing the connection of the funds to a crime. Usually you're going to route it through several different media in order to hide the original source. That's a loose definition of what money laundering is. And so by the time it gets back around to the person that wants it, it's gone through so many channels that you don't know exactly what it was from and what it was for. So with the CBDC, they'll be able to track where the money is going and what it's used for all along that path. If they deem it to be a criminal activity, they can freeze it instantly. And what would stop them from weaponizing that central bank digital currency against citizens or the potential blockage of lawful transactions by groups that don't agree with them, that don't ascribe to certain environmental and social and governance agendas? See where all of that's going? So this is where the ESG comes back into play, all right? So first, they get the businesses, the banks, and the governments all on board by placing people in different positions of power and influence where they can move their organizations all onto that same page, that ESG page, right? Then, that's first. They get everybody on board who matters, who control stuff. They get those people on board first. Then the next level down is to take over the methods of exchanging funds through the FedNow system in the name of efficiency and security. That's how they're going to do it. Then they're going to offer the FedAccounts to the public with the promises of a much higher yield on savings, no concerns about liquidity, no delay between your paycheck being issued and being in your possession. Everything will be instantaneous. Great, primo. And then finally, they'll just eliminate the commercial banks entirely and convert everybody over to the CBDCs. Again, that's going to be paired with the promises of security and convenience. Peace and safety. Sounds familiar, right? Once everybody's on the system, the ESG rules will be fully enforced and applied to everyone across the board. So now we've got you on the teat, basically. Now you're going to jump through all these hoops and do what we tell you to do. Otherwise, we're just going to turn your money off. That's the progression of events. You get the people in control first, then you get the funds moving around, then you get everybody into your funds, and then you tell them what to do. All right. So this will get them everything that they need to interweave all the technology. So they've got the funds, they've got the CBDC. They now it's just a matter of getting people to the point where they're ready to take the mark. All right. That's where biometrics comes into play. Now, a lot of people in the past have said it will be some sort of a tattoo or an implant. That's fine. It's a possibility. It's all about biometrics, though. So while all of that other stuff has been happening in the background, in the shadows, in the smoke-filled rooms, something else has been going on right in our faces for the last 50 years. All right. This is a BioConnect article. All right. There's a link for that one as well. December of 2021 was when this article was written. All right. In 1969, 54 years ago, the FBI began funding an automation process for fingerprints and facial recognition. All right. It's just an automation process for processing the data from fingerprints and facial recognition. But this was a catalyst that created the entire industry that was devoted to different types and uses of biometric data. We're going to go forward a little bit to 1991. Facial detection technology was developed, making real-time recognition possible. In 1994, the first iris recognition algorithm was patented. That was about 9 years after it was realized that everyone's eye is just as unique, if not more so, than their fingerprints. So that was the beginning of using eye scanning, combining that with facial recognition. In the early 2000s, there were hundreds of biometric authentication recognition algorithms were functional and patented within the United States. The biometrics are now, at that point in the early 2000s, were no longer just law enforcement issues, but they're being implemented in large corporation and government settings. They were also sold in commercial products and were implemented at large-scale events like the 2001 Super Bowl. And then in 2013, the Apple phone included fingerprints to unlock the iPhone. 2013, not that long ago, beginning the wide acceptance of biometrics as a means of authenticating. Nowadays, most mobile phones have biometric capabilities. You can use your fingerprint, you can use Face ID, lots of different ways that you can unlock your phone that have to do with your body. And it's become so normal over the last 10 years that pretty much everybody's just like, yeah, sure, whatever, right? So as biometric research continues, we see it being merged with artificial intelligence. Again, this is from the article from 2 years ago. The intention is to construct biometric devices and systems that can learn and adapt to its users, creating a seamless and frictionless authentication process. So basically, if everybody has a biological ID, and that can be assigned to any sort of mark, whether it could be a QR code. QR codes are unique and identifiable. It could be an RFID chip that's implanted. There already are places, I believe Sweden has several thousand people that have RFID chips implanted in their skin. And they use that for everything from making purchases to unlocking their car. Like, the technology is there, right? So as those biometrics become even more and more common, the use of identification proxies may cease to exist. Essentially, what an identification proxy is social security card, driver's license, passport. There's no reason to have that if you have fully integrated biometrics, right? When you can use yourself as proof of your own identity, you don't need to carry around keys, cards, or key fobs anymore. A future that has a rightfully identified society with frictionless transactions, interactions, and access control could be on the horizon. Such a hopeful sounding article. If these people ever read the Bible, they would realize that they're basically walking straight into Revelation 13 with all of this stuff. There's some other things I probably don't need to mention. There was an orb that is being launched by WorldCoin, which is the same, I believe it's run by the same person that started ChatGPT. And also all of the Whole Food stores, which is owned by Amazon, are now allowing palm prints to be used to pay for their groceries at the Whole Food stores. You can look into it more if you want to. Just Google it. It's the orb, WorldCoin, palms at Whole Foods. But all of the technology, I just want to say all of the technology necessary for the mark of the beast, it already exists. It's already in place, and most of it is already widely accepted. It's just a matter of getting a few other people on board or getting rid of them one way or the other. And the thing is, a false prophet is not going to need to coerce people into getting the mark. It's so widely accepted already, people are going to be jumping over themselves to get it because it's going to be convenient and safe and secure. All right. As I highlighted in the clip from Jordan Peterson at the very beginning of my last video, part 3A, tyrants use fear to compel people to do things. They manipulate, coerce, all of that. The only real question is what or who are the people going to be afraid of or told to be afraid of when it comes time to have them get the mark. They're already being conditioned for that. They're already well on their way to accepting it. It's not much longer before you have a large percentage of the population more than willing to inject themselves with something that's totally experimental and hasn't been proven to be safe. Gee, I wonder if anybody did that in the last few years. That's something like 81%, according to the CDC's website, Americans have had at least one poke. So it's not beyond the realm of feasible to see that it will be very easy for the mark of the beast to be implemented. People are already using most of the technology. It's just a matter of bringing all of that together. But again, that will be the last step after getting everybody on board to the FedAccounts, the central accounts, the CBDCs, and then those CBDCs being interchangeable across different nations, because you won't have to worry about exchange rates, because the central banks of the different nations will automatically be able to instantaneously change your fund to their fund if you're traveling. If you're going to buy something in a different country using a different currency, it's all the same thing. It's all the same currency at that point. And then you force people to follow the ESG guidelines if you haven't already brainwashed the majority of the population to think that those are good. And then you make it so, hey, we're going to simplify all of this stuff. Just get this mark or this injection, and you'll be able to go wherever you want, whenever you want, and buy whatever you want, whenever you want. That's how things will progress. And we're at the beginning of that right now. So again, just like I said in my last video, this isn't meant to scare people. This is meant to point out how close we are to the tribulation. If you're like me and you believe in a pre-tribulation rapture, that means we're a little bit closer to that than we are to this. So we don't have to worry about this stuff. But if you know somebody who isn't saved or has questions about the Bible, or if you just are not feeling confident about this stuff being what it will lead to this point, I'm hoping that me pointing this stuff out to you and lay it out the way that I have will make it easier for you to talk to people about this stuff. If you have a friend who brings up stuff about the environment, or brings up stuff about pandemics, or brings up stuff about, the government being a problem, or the banks being a problem, like, you have a way to tie that into, well, yeah, it is crazy what's going on with the banks right now. Did you know that the Federal Reserve is looking at doing these different types of accounts? Did you know that they're thinking about pushing central bank digital currencies on people and what that could lead to? And then you can tie that conversation into, like, the Bible said all of this stuff was going to happen, and this and this and this leads to that. And it's like, we're right there. Do you want to talk about that some more? Like, just do your best to keep your ears open for the people around you who might be lost, who might not be saved. These are opportunities that are becoming more and more present today for us to talk about salvation from the hour that is to come. Revelation 3:10. Because you have kept the faith, I will spare you from the hour of wrath that is to come. I'm paraphrasing that, but we're not appointed to wrath. The bride of Christ is not going to be a beaten bride. We are going to get raptured out of here before that tribulation starts. And we can see the signs that it is coming very soon. And this is possibly the last opportunity that we have to really talk to people about Jesus, about the tribulation, about the Antichrist. Even if we can't get through to them now, we can plant seeds that might grow during the tribulation. They could be some of those tribulation saints or martyrs. It's better to get your head cut off in the tribulation and spend eternity in heaven than to get the mark and spend eternity in hell. So it's important that we have at least something that we can reference and talk about with people if we're going to be here however long the Lord tarries before he calls us home. We should know that we can talk to people about this stuff. Even so, come Lord Jesus, come. I will see you guys in the next video. Until then, Maranatha.